Okay, over the last couple of months, I've been talking about certain concepts, but I thought I was going to spend some time defining the concepts in a very exact way. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to mention certain concepts, I think 2 or 3 of them, on a level, and define them more clearly so that you have an understanding of what they are. When I mean define them, I'm going to explain them in a very deeper way, which I have not done so much in the past. So I hope that I'm clear and that it's completely understandable. Okay, the first concept is the concept of Mashiach. Now, this is a very strange concept of Mashiach. There are a lot of problems with Mashiach. First of all, what we know is there are 2 Mashiachs. There's the Mashiach ben David, who's connected to David, and there's the Mashiach ben Yosef, who seems to come from Yosef. And we know that both of them are mentioned as together, like it's a kind of a twinning, but they're not actually twins, but they're mentioned as both of them. They are 2 neshamas, which are connected to the highest neshama of all, which is called the Yechida, which is kind of the neshama, the lens that we will have that will allow us to relate to Olam Haba. The Yechida is the one neshama that is beyond time and beyond space and beyond the Gashmias and Ruchnias of Olam Hazeh. It is called the Yechida, and it's the 5th neshama. I mean, there are 5 types of neshamas. They're all different, and the 5th of those, the highest one of all, is connected to Olam Haba. It's really the neshama, the lens that allows one to see in Olam Haba. It's connected to the light of Mashiach and far above that. So these 2 Mashiachs are said to be representative, and fundamentally they're addressed as equal in power and so on, which is quite distinct. But the Mashiach ben David is the one who becomes the Klal Yisrael. He becomes the king. So therefore, to qualify as a Mashiach ben David, in every generation, there are 2 people who are born. One is from the Shoresh, the root of Mashiach ben David, and the second is Mashiach ben Yosef, who's the root of Yosef HaTzadik. And there's a lot of things that we've said about these 2 over time, but I want to talk about a very important aspect that I've really never mentioned. The Mashiach ben Yosef is the one that becomes the king of the world when the Messianic period occurs. And he is the Melech of Klal Yisrael. And therefore, in order to qualify as a Mashiach ben David, you have to be, it's a question of royalty. You have to be a direct descendant of David HaMelech. Because kings are dynastic, they're a dynasty that generally descended one from the other. So the Mashiach ben David dynastically is related to David HaMelech, and he becomes the king of the Jews. And he reigns over the world in the Yemos Mashiach until Yom Hadin, or the beginning of Olam Haba. The Mashiach ben Yosef is quite different. He is also a very powerful Mashiach, and we'll talk about him and the Mashiach ben David in a minute. He is the king also, but he is the king really in the first period of the Yemos Mashiach. The first period of the Yemos Mashiach is really the removal of the Zoam of the Nachash. It's the removal of the evil as a substance and as an entity, which is an actual entity of the Chet. And I've explained this before. So the Mashiach ben Yosef is the Mashiach that relates to only the first period or the beginning of the Yemos Mashiach, and he reigns over the world. He's also a king of the world, and he reigns over the world in this while he's performing the function of eliminating the Zoam of the Nachash. Because in order to truly achieve the Yemos Mashiach, I mean, fundamentally, you have to understand the Yemos Mashiach is really a period which brings the world back to the level of Adam Rishon before the sin. Why does the world have to go back to the period of Adam Rishon before the sin? Because the zichuch of the world, to put the world back into a transformed state where it is no longer in time and space, it's beyond time. You cannot have Zoma, you cannot have any remnant of evil, and so on. So to put the world into that state, you cannot have an evil component. So therefore, all evil and the source of all evil, the shorish of Ra, has to be eliminated, at least to the point of Adam Rishon before the sin. I mean, I'm not going to go into the whole thing, and I've gone into it before, that Adam Rishon before the sin had a Yetzer Hara. He had an evil inclination, and he had a temptation to do bad things, but the evil was not a substance in the world itself. The evil of the world was only an impulse that existed in Adam Rishon. But after Adam Rishon sinned with Chava, the evil became an actual component of Olam Hazeh, of this world. He not only was an impulse, but his substance and his presence existed in the world as an entity. And in that form, he's called Zoma, and so on. So the world has to go back to Adam Rishon before the sin, the level of Adam Rishon before the sin, before it can go and become the level called Olam Haba. Because while there's any remnant of evil, there cannot be anything called the future world, which is beyond time and space. So therefore, we have to go back to the Madrega of Adam Rishon Koydem Achet in order to begin the process of Zichor Haguf, the complete elimination of physicality, Gashmias, in the world, so that the world can become an Olam Haba. But I've gone over some of these basic concepts before, and I'm just mentioning them now. So there has to be another avodah in the Yemos Mashiach, and that's what the Yemos Mashiach is about. Because the question really is, why is there such a thing called the Yemos Mashiach? Why is there such a thing as the Mashiach? Why does he have to come? Because it seems to be that the main characteristics of the Yemos Mashiach, the days when the Mashiach comes, is that it says, that the earth shall be filled with the knowledge of God like the waters cover the sea. So therefore we see that the Messianic period is a period which is very exalted. But we don't understand exactly why do you have to have the Messianic period. In other words, because the period of exaltation exists in Olam Haba. That's where it exists. That's where we really understand God in the deepest sense of all. So why is it that before this happens in Olam Haba, the last period of Olam Hazeh, this world, this spiritual, physical world, is called the Yemos Mashiach? Why do we need such an exalted state? And the answer is because we still have a small avodah, we still have a small mitzvahs to do before we get to Olam Haba. So the process of Zichuch does not start. Zichuch means the transformation of Olam Hazeh, this world, into Olam Haba, the future world. The world has to be transformed from time and space so it reaches a whole new level. And that's called Zichur HaGuf, the purification of the body, or the purification of Gashmias and Ruchnias. So in order for that to take place, the Zichur, you have to have the elimination of all Ra, that's number one, and that's fundamentally the job of Mashiach ben Yosef. And then you have to have the elimination of the Yetzer Hara, that the evil cannot exist either as an entity, but it cannot even exist as an impulse, which it existed in Adam Rishon before he sinned. So therefore, evil completely has to disappear on any level, both as an impulse and that also that of an entity, before there can be any movement towards the future world beyond time and space called Olam Haba. So the purpose of the emotional Mashiach is to complete the last work of what Adam was supposed to do and what he didn't do, and so on. So that's fundamentally what's going on when the Mashiach comes. And it says that there are two Mashiachs. One is Mashiach ben David, who becomes the king and rules the world. And one is the Mashiach ben Yosef, who rules the world initially, removes evil as an entity in the world, and then makes way for the Mashiach ben David to become king of the world. Now, the Mashiach ben Yosef still remains a king, but he's a passive king in a certain sense, and he's not active. It's the Mashiach ben David who becomes active. But the truth of the matter is, why are the two Mashiachs? Why isn't there one person, the Mashiach ben David, who can do all of these things? Why do you have to have two people who would have to do this? So what does it mean? What is the differentiation in function between these two Mashiachs? And this is very deep, and it really has to be understood. Well, in order to answer this question, really, we have to go back to the sin of Adam Rishon when he sinned. Now, the name Adam represents a very important concept. The name Adam represents the three letters of the name Adam, represents the words Adam. The Aleph is for Adam, the Daled is for David, and the Mem is for Mashiach. So these three words are included in the title, on the title name of Adam, the first man. So therefore, he really represents three concepts. He, first of all, represents the concept of Mashiach. And second of all, he represents the concept of Mashiach ben David. And third of all, he represents the Zulosoi in his basic avoda, which is called the Adam. So what does this mean? What do these three words mean? And this is very important to understand. Adam Rishon, before he sinned with Chava, was really supposed to be the Mashiach. He was the Mashiach. So what we really see, what is the Mashiach? The Mashiach is actually the Zulosoi, the recipient of Olam Haba, as he does the job of creating Olam Haba. In the title, where the Zulosoi creates the concept and the entity called Olam Haba, the future world, in that regard, he is called the Mashiach. That's all. There's only one Mashiach. The true Mashiach is really the Zulosoi, as he performs the tikkun of Nam L'Ksufa, and he gets the world ready for Olam Haba. In that function, he is titled Mashiach. So then the question is, what does it mean, Mashiach ben David? What is that about? If in that title, when the Zulosei acquires the shlemus of Olam Haba, his title is Mashiach. No distinction in terms of names. There's no David and there's no Yosef, and there's no two of them. There's really only one Mashiach, and that Mashiach is the Zulosoi, when he completes the job of shlemus, of perfection, when he's masakin the problem of Nam L'Ksufa. So what is this second thing of these two Mashiachs? Well, the second letter of Adam, the name Adam, represents David. Why? Because it includes the Mashiach in a different context. If Adam Rishon fails to masakin the world, to masakin the Bria, and so on, if he fails to do it because he sins, then what happens to his role of Mashiach? So what it says is that his role of Mashiach becomes Mashiach ben David. Why? Because in effect, since he as a Zulosoi failed to masakin his Nam L'Ksufa, since he failed, he is no longer titled Mashiach, but rather he is titled Mashiach ben David. And therefore, Adam Rishon, who was supposed to be the Mashiach and do the mitzvah of not eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and then he was supposed to be the Mashiach, he's supposed to be crowned as the Mashiach, which is the title if he does his job of Masakin Nam L'Ksufa. But what happens if he doesn't Masakin Nam L'Ksufa and he does the sin? So what happens is he then drops, he reduces himself, and he becomes an entity called Mashiach ben David. And Adam Rishon no longer is Mashiach, and therefore that possibility goes to David HaMelech, which is thousands of years in the future. In other words, the Mashiach, as is associated with David HaMelech, is a secondary Mashiach, not the primary Mashiach. The primary Mashiach is only one person. He is only one person. He is called Mashiach, and he represents the Tikkun of Nam L'Ksufa. But if Adam Rishon fails, first of all, he loses the ability to get that title, and that title is postponed for a couple of thousand years until David HaMelech, who becomes the source of a new Mashiach called Mashiach ben David. And that person is the Mashiach ben David who Klal Yisrael is waiting for. We first were waiting for Adam Rishon. If Adam Rishon had done the job, he would have been Mashiach, and he would have been the only Mashiach. But instead, we're waiting now for the Mashiach ben David, who's a secondary Mashiach. In other words, he has a somewhat different function. He relates to the Zolosai, but he has a different function. Not only that, when Adam Rishon did the sin and became Mashiach ben David, that necessitated suddenly where the Mashiach split into two. So instead of having one person, the Mashiach, which is the Zolosai, we now have two people called the Mashiach ben David, which is was the name of the former Mashiach of Adam Rishon, but now he's called the Mashiach ben David. And we also have a new Mashiach that never appeared before. It's like the concept of the Mashiach split into two people, the Mashiach ben David, who has one role, and the Mashiach ben Yosef, who has another role. So in other words, now the Messianic process results in two people having two separate roles, but which are connected by the Nun Sharabino, the 50th gate, which is the highest gate of the Torah, the greatest knowledge of the Torah in this world. So therefore, these two Mashiach now represent two different roles, where they used to only represent the concept of Mashiach in one role. So the question now is, what are these two roles? What is the role of Mashiach ben David, and what is the role of Mashiach ben Yosef? So in other words, that the concept of Mashiach divided into two people who would have two different roles that would in certain ways emanate to the Zolosai. So the concept of Mashiach changed, and we want to understand how did it change and why did it change. And we will suddenly understand a lot of new things and so on. What essentially is a Mashiach? What's the purpose of Mashiach? After the thing, the definition of Mashiach was originally the definition of Adam Rishon if he had accomplished the mitzvah. He would have been the one that created Olam Haba, and in that regard he's titled the Mashiach. But since he failed because he sinned and ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and he failed, that concept changed. So the Messianic concept was a new concept. And what's that? That concept is called Sovlech Haloyim. What does that mean, Sovlech Haloyim? God made a contract, especially with the Mashiach, and that contract was, he said to them like this: in order to save the Jewish people, in order to save the Zolosai if it fails, I need someone in a certain sense to participate in this redemption. That's right. So I need someone to assist me in a certain way in redeeming the Jewish people. How? Because that person will have to suffer, and he will have to undo, he will have to perform a lot of sufferings. He has to go into the Golus, he has to go into the Klipos, and in the Golus, in exile, he will remain in a state where he's called a Sovlech Haloyim, which means one who suffers. So in other words, when he suffers, both the Mashiach, especially the Mashiach ben Yosef, who's built for this, he actually saves the Jewish people. God considers his suffering, and the merit of his suffering, he is able to melamed schos. He is able to give a merit to the Jewish people, so that in his suffering, he's able to save the Jewish people from their sins. But the truth is he has another function. Both of them have another function. They not only have to go into the Klippas and the Gullus, they have to go into the dark side, into a terrible dark side of energy, down into the remnant of the resonance of the Ra itself. They have to go into that domain, and in that domain they suffer spiritually, but they also suffer physically. And as they suffer, they are able to redeem the Jewish people from sins. They are able to redeem the Jewish people from sins. But there's something else that they have to do. They have to not only suffer, but they have to also have a certain Yetzer Hara. They both have a certain Yetzer Hara. And that Yetzer Hara is a repetition of the evil inclination of the Yetzer Hara of the Jewish people and of Adam Arishan. In other words, the Mashiach ben David not only suffers, but he has a certain Yetzer Hara, which he can fall if he sins, in other words. And the Mashiach ben Yosef has a certain Yetzer Hara, and so on. And therefore, he's constantly tempted. Both of the Mashiachim are constantly tempted by this Yetzer Hara, which really is a replica of the original Yetzer Hara in which the Jewish people failed. In other words, both of them are really, in a certain sense, they're replicas, they're images of the Jewish people themselves. The Mashiach ben David represents the Jewish people, and the Mashiach ben Yosef represents the Jewish people, in the sense that in terms of the sin that the Jewish people failed to do, they now have that sin in their midst. They replicate that sin of the Jewish people when they failed. Why do they replicate that sin? Because both of them acquire the tremendous merit that they have. Because as they are Mashiachin, they fight this Yetzer Hara. That's right. In other words, they have to do what the Jewish people didn't do. The Jewish people and Adam Arishan did not pass the test, and they could not say no to that Yetzer Hara. So therefore, this test is now given to these two people. It's given to the Mashiach ben David, and it's given also to the Mashiach ben Yosef. And they have to pass the test that the Jewish people and Adam Arishan failed. So therefore, they're subservient to this new task. Both of them are complete images and replicas and so on of the Jewish people who failed. And they have the same Yetzer Hara of their failure. But they have to pass. They have to be Oimid b'Nesoyin. They have to remain standing and pass the test and overcome their Yetzer Hara. And at the same time, they suffer for the Jewish people. So therefore, there are two things that they do. They not only suffer, and their suffering redeems the Jewish people, but they also are tremendous tzaddikim, and they have to pass the test of which the Jewish people did not. And when they do that, they obtain the merit where they are able to suddenly melamed schus on the Klal Yisrael. So therefore, we see the two functions that both Mashiachs have. They both suffer in a certain darkness of Golus, and they both have a Yetzer Hara, which is similar to the Yetzer Hara that the Jewish people failed. But they have to pass it. And in this schus, they allow the Jewish people to be redeemed. And were it not for them, the Ramchal says, they would be annihilated. God would annihilate the Jewish people totally, were it not for the suffering and for the passing of the two Mashiachs that preserve their existence. This is on its own. But why are there two of them? And the truth is there are two of them because each Mashiach represents a different thing. In other words, the Mashiach ben David represents the Zulosoi. He is the replica that represents the Zulosoi, the one who builds Olam Haba. And when he suffers and he passes the Soyan that he has, he's melamed schus on Klal Yisrael. That's why he becomes the king of Klal Yisrael. Of the two Mashiachim, which one becomes the final king? The Mashiach ben David. And the reason is why. Why does he become the final king when in a certain way the Mashiach ben Yosef suffers even more? Why? Because he represents the Zolosoi. He is the substitute for the Zolosoi that would have become the full province of Mashiach if Adam Rishon didn't sin, and if the Jews didn't sin at all. So what they would become is the Mashiach themselves. The Jewish people would be the Mashiach itself. But since the Mashiach ben David, which is a substitute, is a replica of the Jewish people, he therefore, when he succeeds and when the emotion Mashiach starts, he becomes the king of the Jews. Why? Because he is the Zolosoi. He is the Zolosoi in the state of Shlemus, in the state of perfection. So therefore, he becomes the king of the world and the king of the Jews. And therefore, that is established by a monarchy, which is fundamentally inherited from one person to another. But what about the Mashiach ben Yosef? If the Mashiach ben David suffers and works for the Jewish people themselves, for the Zulosoi, so what does the Mashiach ben Yosef does? This is a much deeper thing and so on. The truth of the matter is that the Mashiach ben Yosef suffers. Why? Because he's the one that's not connected to Zulosoi. He's there to save the Zulosoi, but he does not represent them. His suffering and his passing the test doesn't represent the Jewish people, really. But what it does is it represents the Hanhogas. It represents the spheres. So therefore, the Mashiach ben Yosef, the avoid of the Mashiach ben Yosef, is to temper and moderate the Hanhogas, the spheres, which are the basic configuration of judgment. It's the Hanhogas, or the conduct. What are the Hanhogas? The Hanhogas means the way God rules the world and judges the world, the way he assesses the performance of the world. These are called Hanhogas. Hanhoga means to drive or to conduct. So God conducts the world, or he conducts the Zulosoi by certain Hanhogas of Chesed, Din, and Rachamim. And the Mashiach ben Yosef represents these Hanhogas. The Mashiach ben David represents Zulosoi and calls on mercy for the Zulosoi. But the Mashiach ben David, the Mashiach ben Yosef doesn't represent the Zulosoi itself. His suffering represents the Hanhogas itself. Because of his suffering and because he passes his test, he's able to change and transform the Hanhogas so that they become much more softer. He is more tremendous rachamim from the Hanhogas on Klal Yisrael. And the Mashiach ben David is more rachamim on the Zulosoi itself. So the Mashiach ben David gives a schus to Klal Yisrael, but the Mashiach ben Yosef gives a schus where he changes through his efforts the Hanhogas themselves. So suddenly there's much more rachamim. So therefore the Mashiach ben Yosef is in charge of the transformation of the Hanhogas to give tremendous amounts of rachamim to Klal Yisrael to save them. And the Mashiach ben David represents the Zulosoi itself, so that he is worthy of receiving the hashpah, the influence of these Hanhogas. So therefore we see a very big difference between the Hanhoga of Mashiach ben David, between the role of Mashiach ben David and the role of Mashiach ben Yosef. The Mashiach ben David represents the Zulosoi and therefore redeems him. The Mashiach ben Yosef represents the Hanhogas, and he changes the Hanhogas so suddenly they display tremendous rachamim. In other words, the Mashiach ben Yosef is the one who's in charge of the transformation of the Zoyama, of the Nachash. He is in charge of Ra. So because of his efforts, instead of evil being makatrig in Klal Yisrael, instead of evil impugning and accusing Klal Yisrael of their sins, evil then actually supports and tries to save them. So that's why the Mashiach ben Yosef, in a certain sense, in a certain way, it seems to be greater than the Mashiach ben Yosef. And actually, the Ribnitzer Rebbe once said to me that the Mashiach ben Yosef is actually higher than the Mashiach ben David, because he came out of nowhere. Originally, there was only the Mashiach, and that became the Mashiach ben David, because that relates to the Zulosoi. So there was no such thing as the Mashiach ben Yosef. But after the sin of Adam Rishon, he actually created the second Mashiach to modify and soften the Anhogas themselves so that they allow Klal Yisrael to survive, even though Klal Yisrael did sins and was not Masakin Nam Neksufa. So therefore we see a very difference. Since the Mashiach ben Yosef represents the Anhogas and not the Zulosoi, it affects the Zulosoi, but he does not represent the Zulosoi. Therefore, he is a king only in the initial period of the Yemos Mashiach. He is the one who brings the Geula. Why? Because the Geula is what? The redemption. But the redemption means that there's an exile. What does the word redemption mean? That you were redeemed from the position of an exile. If there's no exile, then there's no need for a redemption. So therefore, the Mashiach ben Yosef is the one who places Klal Yisrael into exile, builds up the Ra so that it actually becomes an entity and is able to allow Klal Yisrael to survive totally as against the Midas Hadin. The Midas Hadin wants to annihilate Klal Yisrael, but the Midas Harachim wants to save them. And that's done by the Mashiach ben Yosef. So in a certain sense, his task is greater than Mashiach ben David. And in a certain sense, which I'll speak about another time, Yerovim ben Avot, who was the Mashiach ben Yosef, claimed that he should be first as he entered the temple, not the Mashiach ben David. So God said, no, the Mashiach ben David has to go first because he represents the Zolosoi and he is the final Mashiach. He is the actual king of the Jewish people. So therefore, he has to go first in the temple and so on. So Yerovim ben Avot said, why should he go first? My job is harder. I have to modify the Anhogas themselves so that the Zulosoi is able to survive. And my job is much harder. So therefore I should go first. But God said, no, I'm sorry, I can't put you first because you represent the ability to save Klal Yisrael from its ketugim, from the dark side. But the one who has to go first is the final Mashiach who represents the shlemus of Klal Yisrael in the mitzvahs. But he refused to accept that. And therefore he built the golden calf and forced the Jewish people to worship the golden calf, which is something we'll speak about at another time. So therefore we see a very big difference between the role of the two of them. So the Mashiach ben Yosef is the one who brings the redemption. The one that we are waiting for, actually not we're waiting for, but in a sense, the one that's supposed to come first to redeem the Jewish people is the Mashiach ben Yosef, because he is the one who removes the Zohar of the Nachash, the actual entity of Zohar itself, and he's the one who removes all the aspects of the exile. He restores Klal Yisrael to its kingdom, to Eretz Yisrael, like it says, we should all see the return of the Shekhinah to Zion, where the light of the Mashiach comes back. So therefore, the one who does that, who is the one who does that? That's the Mashiach ben Yosef. He is the Goel that the Jewish people have been waiting for thousands of years, and so forth. But he is the potential Goel, and so on. And therefore, he is the one who actually brings the redemption from exile. So now we see we have a clear understanding of the two Mashiachim. That the two Mashiachim, their function is one to be a Sovel Chalayim, to suffer in the klippas, in the dark side of evil, when it becomes an entity. And they also have to be Oimid ben Esoyin, that which Klal Yisrael was not able to do, and other Mauritian was not able to do, these two have to do. And therefore they are the highest souls that were ever created in Klal Yisrael. Okay, so I have differentiated the two Mashiachim and I have explained their role. And this is about as far as I'm going to go on that subject. The next subject that I want to speak about is the concept of the Midas Harachamim, the attribute of mercy. What does that mean, the Midas Harachamim? God judges
Rabbi,
the world.
Is it possible to ask a question before you finish that last subject?
Yes, I'll allow the time for asking questions at the end of this year.
Okay.
I allow questions at the end of this year to ask. but it's at the end of this year because I don't want to be interrupted in the middle of this year. But I hope that I was explained it clearly in terms of these things. Now, the next thing is I want to speak about is the concept of the Midas Rachamim, the attribute of mercy. And what does that mean, the attribute of mercy? What does that actually mean? So normally we have a certain concept of thing. What's our concept of mercy? That fundamentally when the Jews sin, the attribute of justice accuses them of that, and that's called the kitrug. And then it says, basically, that because of the sins of the Jewish people, they have completely, what? They have completely because of the sin of the Jews, they have completely disconnected from God. They have completely disconnected from God. And when you disconnect from God, then you do not partake of the existence that He's giving you. So therefore, most people don't realize that a sin is catastrophic in its results. Because when a person does a sin, even though it may seem a light thing, he's simply doing something that God said not to do, and so on. So why is it so devastating? Because a sin represents the separation of the Zulosai from the Rebbeinu Shalom. He unplugs himself, so to speak, from God. If God is the source of all existence, then the Jew is plugged in to that source, and that's why he exists. Well, not for the fact that he's plugged into the existence and so on, he would not be able to survive. So technically speaking, according to justice, the true punishment, a Jew who sins, therefore deserves annihilation. He does not deserve pain. According to the Midas Hadin, there's no such thing as pain. The attribute of justice does not want people to suffer. Suffering is meaningless. Why? Because what this person did through his sin was that he disconnected from God. And by disconnecting from God, he disconnected from the source of his existence. So what good is pain? What good is that? That simply tortures a person. It serves no function. So therefore, the true recompense, the true effect of a sin is annihilation, where there's nothing left of him. The person completely disappears. His whole sense of self-awareness as a self and as a Zolosoi completely disappears. That's the true claim of justice. So therefore, in order to save him, God introduces the attribute of mercy. And what does the attribute of mercy do? Well, the attribute of mercy says, well, let's give him pain. And in a certain sense, by giving him pain, it removes the space that he created between him and God. Because when a person sins, he does so through arrogance. He thinks, therefore, God is a you and he's a me. And he says to God, you. And therefore, he's disconnected from God. And therefore, he thinks that he has a certain amount of power. So therefore, every sin has a total level of arrogance. In order to do a sin is to assume that God is outside of you and separate from you. And therefore, you're outside of God and separate from him. And if you believe that, that's a tremendous arrogance, because nothing is outside of God. So the essence of a chet is gaiva, is arrogance. Well, how do you eliminate arrogance? Through pain. When a person suffers in pain, he quickly loses his arrogance. It's impossible to be arrogant and be in pain at the same time. Because when you're in pain, you are a total victim. You are completely passive to the pain, and you realize that you are absolutely helpless. And therefore, pain is the best solution to arrogance. So what God said, therefore I will give you certain pain. So if you don't do the mitzvah, and you don't do tshuva, you don't do repentance, I will put you in pain. What kind of pain? Well, the pain that comes from the attribute of mercy is physical pain or emotional pain. It could be the pain that has to do with your children or your family or physically what happens to you. It could be the pain of anxiety. It could be many types of pain. All of these types of pain, for different reasons, serve different purposes. But the one thing that pain does to a person, it eliminates the arrogance which caused him to sin. So God said, therefore I will give you pain, and therefore you will be able to survive. I will not annihilate you, even though the attribute of justice wants you to be annihilated because of our disconnection, but I will allow you to remain connected to me. But in that connection, you will suffer pain. And in that pain that you suffer, you will eliminate the negative energy of a sin. So therefore, the attribute of mercy is a very powerful thing. It allows us to survive, even though we've disconnected totally from God through our arrogance. So therefore, most people think that the attribute of mercy is a second step, that if a person sins, what happens? God wants to allow him to survive, and therefore he gives him pain. So therefore, in his life, in the next period of his life, he has to go through certain suffering. You see it. Now, once he accomplishes that pain and he suffers because he refuses to do tshuva, to repent, then the negative energy of the sin is dispelled. So therefore, what happens after that? Well, he goes back to the original task, which is the Tikkun of Namlik Sufa, to develop an understanding of who God is, that there's nothing outside of God, and that God is not really a you. You cannot call God a you, because God is part of you. He is part of the person. He is not an outside figure of a pronoun. You cannot apply the pronoun to you. So therefore, he has to go back to do mitzvahs and so on and so forth. Because the function of a mitzvah is fundamentally to understand the yichud of God. The whole way your Mashiach and Namlik Sufa is that you understand that God is not a you. He is not outside of you. God is you. You, in a certain sense, you are in God. You're not outside of him. And that's the whole purpose of creation. So therefore, God wants you to understand his absolute unity, that his unity includes your existence. And then suddenly you have the unity which can put you in the Olam Haba. You can only harmonize with Olam Haba when you appreciate the absolute unity of God. And that's what he wants. So therefore, after you finish your pain and you get rid of the negative energy that you've originally created with your sins, you go to the next step. You return to the step where you're Mashiach and Namlik Sufa. So after that, you continue to do mitzvahs. So this is the order that most people think happens. A person has to do sins. He's obligated to do. A person has to do mitzvahs. He's obligated to do mitzvahs. If he doesn't do the mitzvahs, then the attribute of justice wants to annihilate him because of his disconnect to God. And then suddenly the attribute of mercy comes in and is created and says, no, don't annihilate him. Give him pain to remove this arrogance. And then after that, the attribute of justice then returns after and allows him to do mitzvahs to connect with God. So it's the attribute of justice that removes Namlik Sufa. It removes the distortion of who God is and who you are. The attribute of justice is the attribute that created all the mitzvahs in the Torah. All 630 mitzvahs come from the attribute of justice. And it tests the person through tribulations to see what he thinks of God. Who is God? Is God outside of him? Or is God inside, where everything belongs to God? And that's the fundamental test that a person has to do. And therefore, all the mitzvahs of the Torah come from the attribute of justice. Now, if the person doesn't do it, then the attribute of mercy comes in to save him, to give him pain. And then after the attribute of mercy gives the pain and redeems the person, he goes back to the attribute of justice. He goes back to the function of doing mitzvahs. Why? Because that's how you Mashiach and Namlik Sufa. That's how you get rid of seeing God as an outside you, seeing God as separate from you. So therefore, we see how this works. The cycle is therefore the following. What's the cycle? First, the attribute of justice. Then comes the attribute of mercy if he sins. And then what comes after that is again the attribute of justice to continue the role of his tikkun of Nam Sufa. So fundamentally, that's how most people think of it. But the truth is that's not true at all. Because there's something incredible, something much deeper that happens over here. It's true that the attribute of justice is the one that demands that the person does the mitzvahs and is masaken nam l'ksufa. That's true. But when the attribute of mercy comes in to save the person, it does something else besides saving the person. Not only does the attribute of mercy save the person from annihilation, it's not only that, it's an actual alternative route to being masaken nam l'ksufa. That's right. In other words, God is saying to the person, there are two ways to get to Olam Haba. Either you get to Olam Haba by doing the mitzvahs, or if you don't do the mitzvahs and I have to apply mercy, you will get to Olam Haba through the act of mercy. In other words, the act of justice does not come back totally again. In other words, what God says, once you activate Ra as an entity, and I have to activate the attribute of mercy, that will remain throughout in the entire time that you will be in Olam Hazeh. Once Adam reached into the sin, and the attribute of mercy suddenly became activated, it remained activated. So not only was it a principle where it redeemed the person from annihilation, but it's also a new route. It's a new alternative route that allows a person to masaken nam l'ksufa, which means that the person has to do mitzvahs while he's in darkness. Right? The darkness redeems him from his sins, but he still has to continue to do mitzvahs. So in other words, mercy is not simply the concept of redemption, taking away sins from a person so he survives. But mercy becomes the environment. It becomes the milieu of a person. So while he is suffering in a certain sense for his sins, he still has the free will to build up Olam Haba. So in the act of mercy, mercy creates a new environment, a new milieu, a new setting. And in that setting, it becomes an alternative route where the principle of justice functions in the darkness. And that's called the Gullus. What does it mean that the Shina went into Gullus and the Jewish people are in Gullus? What it means that the Jewish people are in a place which is not conducive to do mitzvahs. But yet when they do mitzvahs in that place which is not conducive because it has a lot of evil in it, this redeems them of their sins also. So does not only pain redeems the Jews of sins, but even mercy redeems the Jews of sins. And it redeems the Jews of the sins because it's also a new route to do mitzvahs. Because now to do mitzvahs is harder in a certain way. And we'll speak about this concept later on, a concept of responsibility and accountability. So in other words, mercy activates pain and it allows the person to continue a new way of creating Olam Haba. He is still involved in the process of making Olam Haba. It's not that simple. So therefore we see that the act of mercy is much more complicated than meets the eye. It not only allows a person to survive the sins that he does, but it allows also in that environment to do new mitzvahs, which are now more complicated somehow in certain ways and so on, but continue to do mitzvahs to earn the tikkun of Nam Sufa and the aspect of Olam Haba. So that's what I mean. So what happens is this. The cycle is not the attribute of justice, then the attribute of mercy, and then the attribute of justice. No, that's not the cycle. But the cycle is the attribute of justice, and if a person does sins, suddenly the attribute of mercy comes in to save him. But the attribute of mercy remains. That the person created remains until it's expiated, and so on and so forth. But it also becomes a new environment, which now a person will do mitzvahs even though he's in the setting of milieu, in an environment which is darkness and so on and so forth. So therefore we see that the attribute of mercy remains. And since the attribute of mercy remains, we see a very interesting thing. That the attribute of justice and the attribute of mercy have a relationship to each other. That's right. And they have therefore what's called a ratio. So at first when Adam Rishon was created, all there existed was the attribute of justice because he didn't sin yet. And since the attribute of justice created the mitzvah of not eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, that was the mitzvah that the attribute of justice created. And when Adam Rishon, and therefore the attribute of justice is said to have existed 100%. So the environment in which one does mitzvahs is the attribute of justice, 100%. But as soon as Adam Rishon sinned, he suddenly activated the attribute of mercy to save him. But that attribute of mercy now only saves him and allows him to exist. But it does something else which is a very deep mystery. The attribute of mercy, you see, the thing is like this, and many people don't understand it, that this is the moving picture of human history. And what is that? A person is created and he has to do mitzvahs, right? How many mitzvahs does he have to do? Well, since Matan Torah, he has to do 630 mitzvahs. Okay, very good. What happens if he fails to do 630 mitzvahs? What happens? So what happens is the person is reincarnated. He comes back down to the earth and he gets a second chance. But this second chance that he gets is usually not the same as the first chance. Why? Because what God says, I see that 630 mitzvahs is too difficult for you. So therefore, I'm going to lower the amount of mitzvahs, or I'm going to make it so difficult to do these mitzvahs that you have no free will. So what is God doing? He's giving a second chance. But the parameters of this second chance means that God is reducing the amount of free will the person has to do mitzvahs. And therefore, even though he's responsible for his sins, he's not accountable. And this is the key concept of accountability. What's the difference between responsibility and accountability? Responsibility means you did it. You did the sin. You did the mitzvah. That's because you're responsible because you did it. But accountable is because you did it, are you liable or not? Do you have to be punished? So therefore, even though you're responsible and you did the sin, you're not accountable and you are not punished for the sin. That's right. Your free will is diminished. And this is a very powerful concept, which I will prove. Your free will to do mitzvahs is diminished. So you do not have as much free will in the second time you're reincarnated to the first time you came down to the world. So therefore, every time that you do sins, not only do you lose things, but many times you're losing free will as well, because God is trying to make it easier for you. If you weren't able to do all the mitzvahs that he wanted in the first time, and therefore have a very great portion of the world to come, God lowers the amount of the world to come, so that you're on a different madrega. When you first come down to the first time that a soul comes to the world and goes in a body to do mitzvahs, therefore it has the potential to acquire the highest level of the future world of Olam Haba. But once you've sinned and suddenly you begin to sacrifice the actual level or the madrega in which you will have in Olam Haba. So God has allowed, by the attribute of mercy, to have lower levels of Olam Haba. When Adam Rishon was first created, there was only one level of Olam Haba. If he had done the mitzvah, he would have acquired that the highest level. But once he sinned, God divided Olam Haba into many levels. So therefore, Olam Haba became not like a business which is owned by one person. Olam Haba became like a corporation, which exists on many levels. And the amount of stock that you have in the corporation determines how much ownership you have of the corporation. So Olam Haba took on the structure of a corporation, whereas by Adam Rishon before the sin, it had the structure of what? Of a single proprietorship. So now there are many levels of Olam Haba. And if a person cannot acquire the top level because of his sins, he can acquire a lower level, but he has to do mitzvahs. But in other words, what's open now to a person, because his accountability has changed, even though he's responsible that he did the sins, but his accountability for those sins is much reduced. And therefore his portion in the world to come is much reduced. So throughout human history, what we see is a very strange thing happening. What we see happening is that human history is nothing more than the possibility for the continuous reduction in accountability. That's what human history is. When mankind fulfills to bring the messianic period in one generation, so God brings back another generation, and these souls are fundamentally reincarnated. But the second generation no longer has the free will of the first generation. It knows it no longer has the accountability, has the responsibility because all the people sin, but they are not all accountable because many people have lost a great portion of their free will. So we see an amazing concept that the act of mercy becomes greater and greater as history goes on. In the beginning, there's only the act of justice. But once Adam Rishon sinned and the possibility of a sin became viable, so therefore God says, I will now introduce the act of mercy, which will become the new environment for the Tikkun of Namlik Sufa. But that environment will protect you. Why? Because now in that new environment of mercy, if you do sins, I will therefore limit the amount of free will. So as history goes from generation to generation, the Zulasoy, or mankind, loses its power of free will, and therefore they lose the ability to acquire what? To acquire Olam Haba. Whereas before they could acquire a large chelik, now they can't. It's a second chance, and a third chance, and a fourth chance. So every time you come back to the world to relive a life, to again have the possibility of doing mitzvahs, you're coming back many times to a lower level of free will. So that what you acquire in Olam Haba is a much lower level. So therefore we see something interesting, that the act of justice and the attribute of mercy do not exist. They exist one. It does not exist one after another, but it exists simultaneously, not consecutively. So originally we thought that first the attribute of justice is, and then you have the attribute of mercy, which gives pain, and then you go back to the attribute of justice. No, that's a consecutive play where each attribute appears followed by the next attribute. But that's not what happens. The structure of history says something different. First you have the attribute of justice, and then if you sin and the attribute of mercy, that remains continuously. So therefore the two attributes of justice and mercy now operate simultaneously, not consecutively. And since it operates simultaneously, it operates as a ratio. In other words, in any specific generation of history, how much is the attribute of justice and how much is the attribute of mercy? And both of these are combined to occur simultaneously. So in the beginning of Adam Rishon, there was no sins. So therefore, the attribute of justice functioned 100%. But after he sinned and God had to put to the attribute of mercy, God had to keep that because the attribute of mercy allows God to reduce free will and reduce accountability. Why? Because the generations get darker and darker. So that means that the attribute of mercy grows and the attribute of justice diminishes. You see? You see how it works? The attribute of justice starts out 100% and the attribute of mercy starts out 0% because there's no need for mercy. Adam Rishon never sinned. But as the time goes on and each generation represents a different level of the ability to acquire Olam Haba, it's a different level and you can acquire a different madrega, then the attribute of justice begins to decline. So in the second generation after Adam Rishon, by the Dor HaMabel, the attribute of mercy became much stronger. So whereas the attribute of justice, so let's say after the sin of Adam Rishon was down to 90%, that means that the attribute of mercy was up 10%. So that the ratio of justice to mercy was 90 to 10. But that will keep on going, it keeps on going down. Justice begins to go down because free will begins to subside. It begins to be reduced. So therefore, the attribute of justice keeps on diminishing, 90%, 80%, 70%, and so on. So by the end of the time of the Olam Hazeh, which is 6,000 years, right? For example, in our time, when we are only 220 years left for the world to exist. The world is supposed to end in the year 6,000. It is now 5,000. Okay, 5,722. So therefore, we only have really 218 years left to the end of the world, the end of physical existence. That's right. But we are so close to the end of human history that the attribute of justice is probably down to 3% or 5%. And the attribute of mercy is what? Is 95%. So therefore, as history goes down, the attributes of the two of them, because they exist simultaneously, have an inverse relationship. As one declines, the other one inclines. As the attribute of mercy, of justice gets smaller and smaller and smaller, allowing less and less of free will and less accountability, by the end of time, the attribute of justice is almost disappearing, and people have almost nothing left of their free will from the attribute of justice. All they have left is from the attribute of mercy, which is now 95% of the people in the world, and so on. So that's why, as we go down in history, it gets worse and worse and worse. How do you see this? Well, in the beginning, the Jews had only one mitzvah for modern region. This was the entire Torah wrapped up in one mitzvah, the highest level of Torah. After that, the Torah was wrapped up in 7 mitzvahs. It only took 7 mitzvahs to effectively perform all 613. It was inclusive. The world always had mitzvahs, but the number of mitzvahs changed from 1 to 7 to 613. But what does it mean to change? It simply means that initially only one mitzvah was able to bring about Olam Haba, and that was the mitzvah of Adam Rishon, not to eat from the Eitz HaDaas. And it finally changed when suddenly the world took on 7 mitzvahs by Noach, even by Adam. So the world now had 7. So what happened to the other 6 the other mitzvahs? Well, all of these other mitzvahs were now incorporated into the 7. So finally, when God gave 613 mitzvahs by Har Sinai, the world now had 613 because each mitzvah had to be done individually. It can no longer be done in a compact way by doing other mitzvahs. It now had to be done individually. But what happened? God then began to reduce even what he gave. He originally gave by Matan Torah 613 mitzvahs, okay. But what happened? God took the Jewish people and put them in exile into Babylonia. When the Jewish people went to Babylonia, the temple was destroyed. So all those hundreds of mitzvahs that were associated with the temple were gone. That means that people they had no free will to do any mitzvahs that had to do with the temple. They couldn't bring any korbanos, any sacrifices. The whole avodah in the Beis HaMikdash disappeared. Because in actuality, the free will of the Jewish people disappeared. When the mitzvah goes and you cannot do the mitzvah again, that means that the free will itself disappears. So therefore, we see how God took the mitzvahs away. And then when God put the Jews in exile, and they left the land of Israel under Babylonia, under Persia, and so on and so forth, under Greek of Rome, and the final exile of Rome. What does it mean? It means that God took away the Beis HaMikdash permanently, and he exiled the Jews among the world to the European nations and then America and so on and so forth. But they were in exile. So what did God take away when he put the Jewish people in exile? He took them away from the land of Israel. So all the mitzvahs that were associated with the land of Israel could not be done. So the mitzvah of Shemitah and Yovel and all the mitzvahs that had to do with these things, and the mitzvah of Trumas and Maasros with the Kohanim. In other words, 2/3 of Judaism disappeared. And that's what we have today. We fundamentally only have 2/3 of Judaism because all those mitzvahs that had to do with the temple are no longer extant. And now we have gone back to Eretz Yisrael, but even so, we don't have mitzvahs that have to do with Trumas and Maasros, Kohanim and Levim and so on and so forth. So therefore, we only have a fraction of the mitzvahs that God originally gave us at Sinai. Why do we have that? Because we only have a fraction of the free will. Because we are now acquiring the lowest levels of Olam Haba. That's right. Most of the people today are not even from. So what they're liable for is only mitzvahs that have to do with the man and man, like Lashon Hara. So when a Jew speaks to Lashon Hara, he still gets a sin. But when a Jew who never was brought up by parents who were Shomer Shabbos, he's not liable for Shemir Shabbos. He doesn't know even what Shabbos is. All the Jews that lived in Russia for the last 100 years had no idea what Shabbos was. They didn't even know they were Jewish. The only reason why they know they were Jewish is because why? Because they had an identity card that said Ivetskaya, Jew. Otherwise, they would not have known. So therefore, all those Jews in Russia, 6 million when it started under communism, knew nothing. The only mitzvahs that they had left were the mitzvahs between man and man, between Jew and Jew. About Lashon Hara, about treating another Jew, not verbally abusing him and so on. Those mitzvahs remain. But most of the mitzvahs between man and God were confiscated. So that means that the actual ability to have free will to decide to do a mitzvah was taken away from the Jewish people. So therefore we see this concept of the reduction of accountability, that mankind was most accountable with Adam Rishon. And throughout all the generations since Adam, since the Dor HaMabel, the Dor HaFloga, and the door of the Nevi'im, then the door of the Golos of what? The Golos of Greece and the Golos of Rome. All these things, we see a constant reduction in the amount of mitzvahs that we have because there's a constant reduction in the accountability. So therefore we see that the ratio of attribute of justice to the attribute of mercy changes. First it was 100 to 0, then it was 99 to 2, and then 99 to 1, and then 98 to 2. It completely reduces over time, so that as time goes by and history proceeds, we have less and less free will, fewer and fewer mitzvahs, and greater acts of mercy. So by the end of human history, the attribute of mercy is like 95%. And the attribute of justice is only 5%. So therefore we see the structure of the two anhogas. So we see that Rachamim is not simply an attribute where God punishes people and gives them pain so that he can take away the sins. No, he does much more. Rachamim exists for good throughout history, and therefore it also lowers the madrega that a person can have when he gains Olam Haba, so that now he can gain a lower level of Olam Haba. So in this way, God says this, and that's what it means. The depth of this really means this. What does it say? It says a Jew is supposed to have Amunah and B'tochen. What is Amunah? Amunah is the belief that God is all-powerful. That's it. When you have Amunah, when you have belief in God, that belief says that there is no one else in Oid Mulvadoi. There is no one else but God. God is the only thing that is manifest, that exists, and his is the only power that exists. There is nothing except him. That's Amunah. But there's another mitzvah that a Jew has to keep, which is called B'tochen. A Jew has to believe. And what is B'tochen? B'tochen doesn't mean that if I really believe that God will help me and give me what I want, that God will give me what I want. No, this is not B'tochen. This is not. The word B'tochen comes from the word trust. And what does it mean? We understand what it means to believe in God, to believe in his absolute power. But what is the concept of B'tochen, trust? Trust means that what it says, Komandi Ovid Rachmana Latav Ovid, whatever God does is for the best. It's for the good. That's it. Whatever God does to you in your life is goodness. How is that possible? It's goodness. I have a lot of pain. Things don't work out. I have a lot of failures in my life. So can somebody tell me how my life is good? Yes, because in all this time, God is applying the act of mercy to you. So therefore, what he's doing is he's cleaning you up from the disconnect that you do with him, and therefore that you threaten your existence. Not only that, he's going to give you olam haba on a certain level, even though you don't do so much mitzvahs. God changed the formula. It used to be that if you do one mitzvah, you get the whole olam haba like Adam Rishon. But God changed that scenario, so that even if you don't do all mitzvahs, you can still get a lower level of olam haba. So therefore, it's very hard for a Jew to lose his chelik in olam haba. That's right. So what does this mean? This means that you can have trust in God. Trust what? That whatever God is doing to you is for the benefit. It's for your benefit. He's saving you. He's not only saving you from annihilation because you're disconnecting from him, but he's saving you for olam haba. True, it's not the highest level of olam haba, but it is a level of olam haba which is beyond time and beyond space, and it's an ecstatic situation. God is still trying to save every Jew to be in a world and environment of pure ecstasy, which is what olam haba is. So therefore, God is only good. God is only good. So therefore, why do I say a blessing when God is good to me and something good happens to me? I'd say a blessing, Tov Yametiv. But if something bad happens to me, I say God, Dayan Emes, God is a true judge. If God is only good, I should say Tov Yametiv under all circumstances, no matter what happens to me. A true Baal B'tochen is capable of saying Tov Yametiv. God is good, he does good, because everything that God does is good. He's either saving you or saving your olam haba, one way or another. He's doing what's wonderful for you. He's allowing you to survive. So why don't I make the blessing, Tov Yametiv, God is doing good? Because the sages said, even though God is doing good objectively, you cannot understand it. We cannot understand this concept. So therefore, the concept is even by the Holocaust. The Holocaust was the most evil period ever done to the Jewish people. So where do you see the good in that? Well, God obviously felt that in order to do this, in order to save people for olam haba, he had to perform such a thing. Only he knows exactly what a person has done every time he has come down to the world and become human. Who knows what he has done in this world every time he's come down to the world? A person can come down many times and he can do many things. We do not know the judgments. We have no idea. But one thing we do know, that God is a true judge. The sages said that a person cannot make a blessing. God only does good when he cannot see that. Because goodness is something you have to experience. It's not something that you have to know. You cannot make a blessing on something which you know, only on something you experience. So therefore, when something bad happens to us, we make the blessing that God is the true judge. Because minimally, we have to accept the fact that God always knows what he's doing. He is never in a position where God is doing the wrong thing. God is never committing an injustice. That's when people die, sometimes when people die in crimes and so on, people said it's unfortunate because a person died unnecessarily. The word unnecessarily is an absolutely ridiculous word. Whatever God does is necessary and is good. We don't know why God did this, but God did this because fundamentally he is good. He is saving you from your act that wants to annihilate you. And number two, he is saving you for a portion in the world to come, which is an incredible ecstatic experience. And in that sense, everything which he does to you in one way or another supports that. When the Mashiach comes and he explains all of this to us, and he will do that, that's what the Mashiach will do when he arrives, we will understand that God was only good to us. He was only good to us. He was never bad to us. Even though we felt pain, but that was some pain that was created to save us. So we are the ones who create the pain. By virtue of the deeds that we do, we create this pain and the necessity of pain. God does not give us pain at all if we don't deserve it. It says that if a person puts his hand in his pocket to take out a quarter, and by accident he takes out a dime, and he feels a certain amount of frustration, even that pain of that frustration because he took out the wrong coin is not given to a person unless he did something bad. God doesn't give the slightest iota, the slightest scintilla of pain to anyone who does not deserve it. That would be a false judge, and God is the absolute true judge. Now you may say, well, how can God manage such a thing? He actually has to watch the performance of every human being that was ever made and was ever reincarnated over and over and over again. How can God manage that? How does he compute that? Well, I'll tell you something better. If you want to know how God computes that, you know how many stars they estimate are in the universe? That's right. Universe is estimated to have what? To have 100 billion galaxies. And totally together, all the stars in the universe is 2 trillion. That's the number 2 with 12 zeros after it. That's how many stars there are in the universe. And each star is like our sun. Do you have any idea what it takes to manage 2 trillion stars? So we cannot talk about God's ability to manage anything. Since he is everything, he can manage everything. Everything that he created, and even those things which are not created. That's not an issue for God. And in that management, there is never given an ounce of pain to a person who has not deserved it, or it's not to redeem him. Every pain and every bad news and every failure that a person experiences is for his benefit, to either redeem him from sins that he did, or to give him a portion of the world to come. Because God is only good, and someday we will only say the bracha of Ya'atov Yameitiv. So therefore we see what the Mashiach is and what Rachamim is. What I've done today, I've explained what is the Mashiach, what is the Mashiach does, why are there two Mashiachs, why is the Mashiach ben David the king in the end, and Mashiach ben Yosef is only the initial king, why? So I explained one is connected to the mercy given to the Zolosoi, that's the Mashiach ben David, and the Mashiach ben Yosef is connected to the mercy that's extended to us through Anhogas. That's why the nisyonis of each Mashiach is different. And we see what the act of mercy is not only a way where God redeems us from our sins, and he saves us from our sins, but it's an alternative route that while we're being saved from our sins, we move forward in terms of the tikkun of Naam Ksufa. We move forward in building Olam Haba. So we do these two things at the same time. To the extent that justice oversees us, we are building Olam Haba through whatever mitzvahs we do. And to the extent that mercy oversees us, we are redeeming ourselves from what? From sins that we have done. We are redeeming ourselves through the pain. But we are also redeeming ourselves for a future Olam Haba. We are still acquiring an Olam Haba and a different Madrega. God has not abandoned us. He never abandons us. Even though we are incapable of getting the full level of Olam Haba, which we should have gotten, but he never abandons us for the possibility of obtaining a certain level, a certain Madrega of Olam Haba. And that's the concept of B'tochen. That's the trust that you can have. And that's a trust that he's entitled to. So therefore, I've explained today what the Mashiachim do, why there are two of them, and what they do, and what their function is, and what they do as their role as the king and the secondary king. And I've also explained the Midas HaRachamim, the relationship between the attribute of justice and the attribute of mercy, that they work simultaneously, not consecutively. So in the end, God is continuously managing us, every person, Every person God sees every second of the day. That's right. Every human being on earth, whether you're Jewish or you're Goy, God knows who you are. He knows your panemius, and He knows what you're doing. And also He knows how to save you, and He is saving you. And just like there will be many Jews that He has saved for Olam Haba, or come out all of them, there are also many Goyim that He is saving for Olam Haba. Because even though the Goyim rejected the Torah at Har Sinai and they became Goyim, God still did not take away Olam Haba. That through the Jews in their mitzvahs and so on, they create Olam Haba. And once they create Olam Haba, a Goy cannot create it, but he can be in Olam Haba. So God is even good to the Goyim. He is especially attentive to good Goyim and Goyim who really believe in God and don't do evil and so on and so forth. And all those Goyim who do evil, the Goyim of the tyrants of China and Russia and so on, and most of the world and so on, these Goyim will have no portion in the world to come, but they have no idea. If these Goyim from the world, especially China, especially Russia, especially a lot of Africa and so on, and even in America, unfortunately, at this time, if these Goyim knew the jeopardy that they put themselves in, that by persecuting Jews, they literally will be destroyed and have nothing in Olam Haba, they would fall down on their feet and beg the Jews for forgiveness. They will beg the other Goyim who they persecute for forgiveness, because these Goyim will no longer be with us. They will be absolutely annihilated in Olam Haba unless they repent. Even the China's Communist Party, as evil as it is in terms of prosecuting 1 million Uyghurs and so on, and the evil that they have done, Mao Zedong in history, even they can still do tshuva. And Russia and Putin and so on and so forth, all of them can still do tshuva. There's still time for them to acquire at least some level of Olam Haba. But one day the attribute of justice will only rule the world. When the Mashiach comes, there will be no attribute of mercy. You should know. There will be no attribute of mercy. It will be gone. The only attribute that is left is the attribute of justice. And then they will all be in trouble. Terrible trouble and so on. So we're at the last licks and so on. So fundamentally, I've tried to do this. I hope I've been clear to explain the Mashiach and the attribute, the two Hanogas, the ratio of the Hanogas, and the simultaneity of their function in terms of the two of them, and so on. Okay, that's the share. Any questions?
Yes, Rabbi. I've got a question on the first part of the shiur.
What is that?
Can you go over the differences in the Yitzaharas and the impulses that the Mashiach ben David and Mashiach ben Yosef would be feeling and experiencing? Do you have a handle on that?
No, I can't. I may have a handle on it, but it's not. It's first of all, it's very deep. It would require a lot of time, and I can't do that right now. But I will talk more about it. The main test of the Mashiach ben Yosef is what? Since he oversees the mercy that's extended from the Hanogas, therefore his main test comes from Yesod, which is part of the Uran, comes from the sphere of Yesod. And the main test that has to do with Mashiach ben David, since he represents the Zolosoi, is what? Malchus. It's a Malchus. So the Mashiach ben David represents the sphere of the Shechina and the sphere of Malchus, which is the Zulosoi, and the main test for the Mashiach ben Yosef represents the principle of Yesod, which is the sixth sphere that gives over the energy to the Shechina. But that's the thing I could say. One has to do with Yesod, and one has to do with Malchus. That's why.
But
that's
Ben
what
David
I'm saying right now.
Ben David sits through the sphere of Malchus?
Malchus is the Shechina. The 10th sphere is Malchus, and it represents its Keneged, the Zulosoi himself. Whatever happens to the Shechina happens to the Zulosoi. So the two are interrelated in the sphere of Malchus, and that's the Mashiach ben David is a Sovel Chaloyim. He's the one who allows mercy to be extended to the Zulosoi. And the Mashiach ben Yosef is in the Tikkun of Yisod. He allows the attribute of mercy to extend in the Hanhogas so that they're soft and they're modulated, and he therefore manipulates the Ra so that it can perform all the things that it has to do.
I think I can understand the test that would be involved if it's involved with the Yisod, but what about Malchut? What type of test would be involved in that?
Well, that would be a different. First of all, that test it has to do with. Well, it actually requires a whole shir. Malchus is different than Yisod.
You want me to give a shir on that? You want me to give a shir on that?
I want who?
Are you willing to give a shir on that?
I'm not sure. First of all, I don't have a clarity on that necessarily, and it's a very deep thing and so on. How the Mashiach ben David suffers and how the Mashiach ben Yosef suffers, they suffer in two different ways. And the suffering of the Mashiach ben Yosef is greater than that of the Mashiach ben David, because the Hanhogas are much more difficult to soften than the Zolosoi. But we'll think about that in the future. Any other questions? Okay, I hope you all enjoyed it.
Shimon, just an observation, not a question. Shimon, just an observation. The Yosef represents the Yisoid, which is the Zerampen, which is the channel for all the Hanhogis Milaela L'Sata. Right?
Right.
It makes a lot of sense.
Right, that's the mashal. That's the metaphor. That's the mashal of the Kabbalah.
Yeah. And the Malchus, like you said, represents the Zolosai, so it coincides very well, what you said.
Right. Yeah, this coincides exactly. If you understand what I've said, you have a much clearer understanding of why there are two Mashiachim, what they represent, what they do, what they have to do, and what will happen in the end in terms of their functions, in terms of kingship, royalty, and so on. Why each one becomes a different relationship to royalty, and each one has a different function in terms of the act of mercy. And they're both very big sources, and they're very, very big in mind to be oimid and asoyim. But so I've said a lot of things about Mashiach that I've never really explained so clearly, and I've said a lot of things about the attribute of justice and mercy. I've said a lot about the attribute of justice and mercy. And there's a phone there that someone has.
Yeah. And you understand also, according to your share, why the Yosef is so much higher than the David, because the Yosef represents the interaction that God interacts with us.
Right.
So it represents God's Anhagas. That's a much higher representation than representing the Zalot.
Yosef is connected to the Anhagas, to the Zir Ampen, whereas David is only connected, and not only, but he's connected to the Shina, to Malchus and the Zulosoi. And that's why Yerav and Avat thought that he was bigger. He wasn't a gaiva. People think that Yerav and Avat, when he said, I should go first, mi barosh. So everyone thinks that Yerav and Avat was the gaiva. No, he was not. He wasn't a gaiva. I mean, he was a gaiva, but not because of that. He was right. Because the Mashiach ben Yosef does the avodah, which is much more difficult in a certain sense. And so on. His klippas are much greater than the klippa of the Mashiach ben David. So he said, I should go first. But God said, we don't go on the amount of effort you have to put in, but we go on the sequence is what determined it. And because in the end, the Mashiach ben David is the one who becomes the actual Mashiach. That's the important thing. What we go we go after the shlemus. We go, Seif Maisa b'machshavat tchila. Okay, thank you for listening.
If Shim, tell me if this is true, but probably the Rebbeinu Shalom's biggest taiva is atava, if you will, his rotten, and he feels that if David would be the Rosh, then the Zolosa would have a stronger representation, so there'll be a stronger Hatava. Because he represents
I don't
the
know
Zolosa.
You want to compare the Anhogas to the Zolosai, but I don't know if you're making the right comparison. Each one represents a different aspect of the Avodah of Nam Ksufa. The Zolosai is the one who does the Tikkun of Nam Ksufa, and the Anhogas are the assessment of that performance in terms of to measure Olam Haba. So there's a different thing of the two of them. I'm not sure that this is the correct way to see it.
Rav Shimon,
thank you.
Rav Shimon, I was curious. In the end of time here, the Rishayim, let's say the Chinese communists, they're the last ones, or the Russian Rishayim who hurt people. They're the end of the line. Could they have a taina on Hakadosh Baruch Hu, and they could say, listen, everybody else, they got a chance to come back again to suffer, and we're the last, oppressors. We don't get that chance. It's not fair. Being at the end of the line is like a very unlucky position to be in.
Well, look, it's their choice. They don't have to be so evil. They don't have to be so compulsively evil in terms of what they do. And that will apply to many of them. Many of them. And we're talking about history itself. The Germans throughout history. I mean, the evil that was done by the German nation, the evil that's done by the communists, the evil that's done by the tyrants and the kings of history. There's a tremendous amount of evil. Some of these people will have the pain and will be redeemed, but a lot of these people will not be redeemed. I mean, they're really headed for annihilation, and they have no idea. They think they have power.
Couldn't they make that complaint? Couldn't they make that complaint that they run out of time? Being at the end, you run out of time. You can't. Isn't that a complaint they could lodge against Hashem?
What?
If we had more, if you had given us more time, we could have been reincarnated, and we could.
I got news for you. God is not an endless spigot. He sees in these people there's an absolute core of evil. Because of all the times that they've appeared, they have specialized in evil. God will eliminate that evil from the world. This is not an endless situation where God does it over and over. History is not designed to go for 1,000,000 years. History is going to only go for 6,000 years. 6,000 years is the amount of time that every person on earth in all of human history has decided who he is and where he's going. And many of them, God does mercy a tremendous amount. But it's not endless mercy. Because God sees that in their souls, they have incorporated evil to the highest level, and they cannot be redeemed.
Uh-huh.
Okay, thank you very much for listening, and I will see you in 2 weeks.
Rav Shimon, I just make one statement. I'm sorry, but what you're saying now, as far as the Rishayim today, how even they can do tshuva, it seems to contradict what we've learned in the past, especially you quoted the Rambam, who says that the Chasidei Humus HaOlam will have a chelik, that none of the tzaddikim of the Goyim will make Olam Haba. It's only the Chasidei Humus HaOlam.
That's
the so, I mean, the
Rambam. You're discussing the concept of Goyim in terms of Olam Haba. The fact of the matter is that God wants to give Olam Haba to the Goyim too, in the sense of with the Madrega. He also wants to do that. God could have stopped the Goyim from existing by Matan Torah. God could have said, you don't accept the Torah, and that's it. So you have no purpose to exist. right? He could have stopped it then. Why did God continue the world? One reason is because God in his mercy wants to save them too. That there are many goyim who are Ehrlich mentioned, sincere people and so on. You know, like what the Rambam means by Chasidu Solam or Tzaddik Olam, we're not clear on that. I don't know if we're not clear exactly the madrega that a goy has to be to earn Olam Haba. I don't know.
Right.
That the Rambam sheet is right, Chassidus, but I don't really know. But without a doubt, the Rebbeinu wants to save as many goyim as he can. But those goyim are good goyim who've never punished Jews, never tortured Jews, never tortured other people. But the people who tortured other people, and especially Jews, goyim who killed Jews, I mean, they're finished. Because they are destroying their gatekeepers. The gatekeeper to Olam Haba is the Jew. And what did the goyim do? They took what the Jew gave to the goyim. The Jew gave a great goodness to the goyim. And how does the Jew say? Okay, you wanna become you wanna develop a new religion? Okay, you can do that. But you then use that new religion to annihilate Jews, to kill Jews? Are you such a balgaiva that not only do you want to create a religion which doesn't make much sense, but you want to annihilate the one people who are the representatives of God in the world? I mean, how high is your level of arrogance?